let's come to Vision 11 finally. And we're trying to appreciate again and understand that we're in a phase learning. This is a new learning. It has never been seen in the world before. This is new. This is original. Learning for many hundreds of years has been by subject, by discipline. Before that, it was the student learning what the teacher knows. It was learning by teacher. And teachers were a development from an earlier level where there was someone who was able to teach, but whose pupil was only somebody who was royal, like the king. And that figure who always advised the king, who taught the king, was always a magician. It is Merlin who makes King Arthur. It is, in a very interesting way, always that Thoth teaches the Pharaoh. He must know. The king must know. The common, ordinary people do not need to know. And so learning has gone through many eras and changes, and this is a new era. This is a completely new. The ancient way to call it was by a time form. It's not only that there are time forms of days and weeks and months. One of Shelley's famous lines is, "Days, weeks, and months, which are the rags of time." They're the shards, they're the poor relation. It isn't until you get to a year that you begin to have a time form that is complete in many vicissitudes. And so a year, an annual cycle, is very important as a time form. And the accrual of time forms in human life achieves its vitality of wholeness when maturity comes after birth, after that cycle. And the classic way of understanding that was that it takes a number of years to make a generation. And that really generations have a relationship to each other, so there's like the parental generation, and then there's your children's generation, so that you occupy the middle of a 3-generation long time cycle. There's you, there's your parents, then there's your grandparents. Or there's your parents and there's your children, and you're in the middle. So that 3-generation time cycle is roughly 100 years. It's roughly a century. But there were larger time forms called millennia, which were 10 centuries, 30 generations. But the most powerful time form came from ancient Egypt and stuck into a very deep quality of the ancient world. And that was, there is such a thing as pairing even in time forms. And the largest time form that antiquity took a look at was the cycle, the frequency of a double millennium called an aeon. And that if you take a aeonic double millennium, a 2,000-year period, if you run that 13 times, you will have a time form that in Plato was called the Great Year, little under 26,000 years. And it turns out that that time form is a very large, real solar system time form. It's the time that it takes for the sun to go through all 12 signs of the zodiac in the real space of the universe. So that great year was a great year of the sun's completeness vis-a-vis the earth in every possible vicissitude. Now our education, our learning, is a cycle of paired years because it is necessary to take a short enough duration that is nevertheless complete, that could carry its scalar all the way up to the very largest sizes, and yet is within reason so that one can also carry it down to all the smallest details that one would like to have. And phasing allows us to have a double annual cycle of 4 phases for each year so that they match up. A pair of 4s makes an 8, makes an octave. And within each 4, there is a pair of pairs. And that the syncopation between these paired phases is that one of them will be a process in its emphasis, and the following phase then will be a form phase. And so they syncopate. A phase of process, a phase of form. Which means that every other phase will have similarities to its grandparent. Decades ago, I used to call this phenomenon grandfathering or grandmothering. We have a deeper affinity with our grandparents in terms of long ranges than we do with our parents. With the parent phase, there's always a tension. There is, first of all, a tension of emergence. Then there's a tension of maintaining a distinction, not to get swallowed back up, not to be forced to live in the parent's world all the time, but to be able to be distinct from it, emerge from it, be independent from it. Whereas the grandfather phasing does not have that onus because one didn't emerge from it, but one is similar to it in the sense that you are naturally, you can participate in the grandparents' way without being threatened by being indistinct or co-opted. Our first phase is nature, and the third phase is mythic experience. So that experience is never jeopardized by a tension with nature. If experience flows with nature, it doesn't lose its distinctness, and the tension is not one that has to be maintained in a difference, but it's one that is free to be similar, to be participatory, to flow together. And so when nature and experience flow together, experience is fortified in such a way that it is not only deeper, but its qualities are deeper. And so if one's life is, as the French phrase, au natural, one has a better quality of life, better quality of experience. But just as experience, as the mythic phase is a process phase like nature, visionary consciousness is also a process. So that experience, when consciousness comes into play, when vision is really operative as a phase, experience now has a double quality to it for the first time. It can flow with nature, or it can flow with the visionary phase of consciousness. Now, part of the problem was that when that first began to be noticeable enough that someone could be conscious about being conscious, that one could be not just reflective on consciousness, but conscious that one was conscious, that particular stage in the world occurred about 5,000 years ago. And the people who were conscious about being conscious at that time were the magicians. Not just shaman, but they were the magicians. And one of the first places that one finds a written consciousness about consciousness, not just symbolic writing or mythic stories put into symbolic writing, but visionary consciousness brought back into symbolic writing, is about 4,000 years ago. And there are two documents that we have from the Middle Eastern part of the world that record this. One of them is in New Kingdom Egypt and is the Book of Coming Forth by Day, the Egyptian Book of the Dead. The other is the Gathas of Zarathustra, written about 2000 BC as well, about the same time. They're contemporaneous. The magician of the Egyptian Book of the Dead is Thoth. But the magician of the Gathas of Zarathustra, the original Gathas, is Zarathustra, who is not a magician, but he is a spirit poet. He's a poet seer. And so the early Iranian consciousness of consciousness, the early Iranian vision to experience in a kind of a poetic, hymnal way, whereas the Egyptian relates in a deep, mysterious, natural way. And so one has different tones and different qualities, and about 2000 BC, the only sustained contact between these two types of visionary and natural experience, the only sustained contact were the people that ran the caravan routes between those two parts of the world, linking Iran and Egypt. And the people that ran the caravans linking them were the first Jews, Abraham and Abraham's father Terah, and the whole lineage that came out of that. And they experienced one of the first international polarities, because the Persian quality was one of a maternal heartfulness, that life can be nourished and is joyful, and one can sing about it, write poems about it, hymns. Whereas the Egyptian was stringently patriarchal, that one has to be very clear about what you're doing, you have to be exact and experience, while it can participate with nature, has to do so through the correct rituals. Whereas the Persian, the Zarathustrian quality, is that it's not the rituals that are the arbiter, it's the symbols. One has to have a mind that is able to transform into a poetic, so that experience can be visionary in a beautiful way. Whereas the Egyptian was, one has to be very precise here about what you really do. And at each juncture in the steps of what you're doing, there are pivotal steps like gateways, and at each gateway you have to make sure that you're able to go through that gate in the right way. And if you don't in the right way, you get stopped right there. And so you have to have a formula which allows you to progressively go through all the steps and all the gates in the Egyptian wisdom, so that that mysterious nature fortifies experience and it flows eternally. Whereas the ancient Iranian is that the emphasis is on the mind, on its symbols, and that those symbols must be transparently open to allow experience to go through it into visionary consciousness without losing its flow, its ability to flow. So that the mind must be transparent to consciousness, whereas the Egyptian is, no, it's that the body must be transparent to natural mystery. And so for the first generations of the Jewish caravans, Abraham ran the first permanent caravans between Egypt and Iran through what is today Iraq. And in northern Iraq, the city that was the center of the caravan business. Caravan route went north into what is today Turkey. Part of it went over to the coast through Syria to where Lebanon is now. Another went down the Transjordan side where Jordan is in Amman and crossed the Jordan River at a place where there was a pass in the mountains that are the ridge between the river and the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. There's a mountain ridge. Jerusalem is up on one end, very high end of that ridge, and there's only one big pass that goes through that mountain range, and that pass crosses the Jordan River from Jordan and goes through between two very prominent peaks. And one of the peaks was the ancient home of the worship of in the Middle East 2,000, 3,000 years ago. And the other peak was never occupied because it's somewhat smaller. So when the Jewish caravans came through that particular pass, they commandeered the smaller peak to be their first sacred mountain. It's called Mount Gerizim. And at the foot of Mount Gerizim, because if you're running a caravan business, you need to have, besides business contacts, you have to have a place to get supplied. And one of the first supplies you secure is water. So the well at the base of Mount Gerizim is Jacob's well, because he's the first one to really secure that in a deep way. It had been secured by his grandfather, Abraham, already. Otherwise, he couldn't have run his caravan business. Abraham had a very deep problem with his son, Isaac. He had a patriarchal problem with him. Because when he ran into really deep difficulties, he was willing to kill his son as a sacrifice to get out of the situation. And the place where that sacrifice was going to take place was on the top of Mount Gerizim. And that's the first time that you find the revelation to that patriarchal tradition: you shall not kill your son as a sacrifice, because you can sacrifice something else which will do just as well. You can sacrifice, in the case of Abraham and Isaac, instead of him sacrificing his son, he sacrificed a goat that he saw that had its caught in a bush, a thorny bush. On Gerizim, it's high and it's still deserty, and so they're not trees, but bushes. A lot of Southern California mountains are like that. The mythic image of the goat whose horns are caught in the bush is a very ancient Near East image going back thousands of years before that. It goes back to the first domestication of animals, sheep and goats, back about 10,000 BC. Not far from that region. the first agricultural city in the world was Jericho, which was first settled 12,000 years ago as a farming community. And then went through lots of vicissitudes because it was difficult to sustain these things that early on. But when Jacob, the grandson, came back, he had to reestablish the well and the rights to the mountain because Isaac had let a lot of this go by the boards and had allowed a lot of difficulties, so that Jacob's mother realized he was not going to be able to really grow up whole. He had a problem with his slightly older twin brother, Esau, because the mother had taken the father's blessing, Isaac's blessing. He was losing his eyesight, and the mother had moved the blessing to the younger son, younger by about 2 minutes in birth, but still, in ritual, the younger son. So Jacob had to leave that area and go back to Haran, to go back to work for mother's father, Laban, who was extremely powerful at that time. And Laban tricked Jacob into having to work 2 7-year periods because he had to work 7 years to get a bride. And then Laban slipped in the older sister at night when the marriage was consummated. So he was technically, and then he said, well, you can work another 7 years and you have the other daughter as well. And between those 2 women and their 2 serving women, all the 12 tribes were born out of that. The zodiac of the inheritors of that linking caravan, but also of the tradition of the disproportion between the mother and the father, between the loving heartfulness of patriarchal care for the generations, for life, for people, and the patriarchal insistence that it must be done exactly right or we are not going to be able to survive. And so you get this mother-father bind. And in the tension between that, in the urge and need to protect the distinctiveness to the independence, a whole raft of problems came in from tradition, from mythology, and lodged in the mind in ideas that were not very clear, in images that were extraordinarily clear and literally did not just register in the mind, in the imagination, but seared it, branded it. The difficulty is that when all of that became energized in a much larger way, when civilizations became much more powerful, and there weren't just a few caravan routes, there were huge caravan routes, shipping lanes, like around the turn of the millennium 2,000 years ago, the Roman Empire had ships that not only to southern India, but all the way to Vietnam. They had contacts with the Han Chinese in complicated overland stages through Iran and so forth that had caravan routes for over 2,000 years at that time, all the way to China. In Zarathustra's time, the caravans ran all the way from where Samarkand is now, all the way into Central Asia where Khotan is. And it's because of the Iranian influence in Central Asia that you get dynastic China for the first time. And dynastic China has something that they never saw in China before then: chariots. And chariots come because they come from where horses have been tamed, in the grasslands of Central Asia. And you get chariots for the first time not only in China, but you begin to get chariots for the first time in Egypt. When everything got energized, when the Roman Empire really got together under Augustus Caesar, he was like a masterful godfather, meaning not just to have another civilization or the best, but to have the civilization, no competition. So that everyone in the world, in the known world, is going to be calibrated by our authority. We're running it. And one of the deepest problems that they had is that they had spread pretty evenly between what was called the Western Empire and the Eastern Empire. From not just Rome, but the dividing line was actually classical Greece. Everything from the Aegean Sea west all the way to the British Isles and Ireland, all the way up into Germany, was all the way across northern Africa, all the way to Morocco. All of that was the Western Roman Empire, and everything from the coast of Turkey on east was the Eastern Roman Empire. And so they had to keep a balance between East and West, and part of the difficulty is that in the East, the ancient was matriarchal, whereas in the West, the ancient tradition was paternal, patristic. And so you have this curious quality of the Roman imperial style wanting to make sure that there is a balance between the two. So they built on what was the northern edge of Rome at the time, along one of the most powerful roads, the Via Flaminia. The Flamins were priests of the social order. The Via Flaminia went north from Rome, which was the major street of power at that time. Not the Appian Way that went south, but the Via Flaminia, because it went into all the power districts of Rome, where Florence is now and Venice and so forth, all of that, Transalpine Gaul. Right at the edge of Rome, where there was a gate to come in, they built what is called the Ara Pacis Augusti, Augustus's temple of eternal peace. And in it, it was like a pillbox-shaped building with royal steps that go in. And when you go into it, against the back wall, there was a frieze of Tellus Mater, Mother Nature, opulent, like not just with a cornucopia from ancient Paleolithic times, but she has all the good things that come with civilized peace, the children, the food, the corpulent, beautiful mother, woman, not a lover, the kind, universal mother. And on the outside of this structure was a double frieze that had all of the power people of the time in sculptural engraving. And there was Augustus and his wife and all the power people of the Roman Empire. So you had the Egyptian power parade on the outside, and you had the nourishing universal mother on the inside. And this was the balance. We maintain the outside of the structure of our empire by masculine power, not just by the lex Romani and senators, but by the legions. We have 22 legions, and they're killers. But on the inside, we are very forgiving, because as long as you agree to let us rule you, we will take care of everything. You'll be fine. There'll be peace. And Augustus promised that this was the winning combination. One of the difficulties was that they knew that you have to watch out for magicians. You have to watch out for magic. You have to watch out for somebody who has a transforming power that you can't control, that your empire doesn't control. You have the ability to deal with experience through ritual to nature. You got that covered. And you can do deal with the symbols that come out of experience into form, but you cannot control in that way, imperially, consciousness. And so they were always afraid that some real deep vision is going to come out of left field, as it were, out of the upper transcendental air, as it were, and pull the plug on the whole empire. And so they covered their bases. CYA, they covered other things. They made it a state crime, any prophetic literature written down. Why? Because they wanted to commandeer the symbolic level. And so they had professional people that searched the whole empire to destroy any prophetic written literature. And one of the biggest deals was the Sibylline writings, because the origins of Rome's own development were all prophesied by the... And these kinds of prophetic writings had somehow to be preserved, but the state had to destroy them. How are you going to do that? And so Augustus, who was very brilliant, he had the best power minds in the world working for him. He had everybody who was brilliant at power working for him. And so he commissioned the best poet of the day, Virgil, to put the prophecies into an epic called the Aeneid, so that they would be preserved, and then we'll destroy the actual writings themselves, the Sibylline writings. The difficulty was that Virgil was really a poet, a very great poet. And so when he was working with this material, he also, while writing the Aeneid, it took a long time, he got a vision. And eclogues, the fourth eclogue is a vision of the Messiah. The magical divine babe who will take away the men in the empire and return the world back to its magical, conscious mysteriousness. It's called Virgil's Messianic eclogue. Difficulty exacerbated the Roman Empire for 3 editions until finally 2 radical solutions were promoted. The first radical solution was, let's kill all the people and proscribe them and get rid of them out of the empire. Well, is it a Jewish problem? No, we've dealt with the Jews before. We know about them. So it's some sect of the Jews. This visionary sect. They're beginning to call themselves Christians. And so under Nero, the whole thing was to persecute the Christians. Let's get rid of them. Not just feed them to the lions, but let's make it very difficult for them to be aware. And a huge visionary curse rose in Nero's psyche. And he began to suspect that Rome itself was polluted by magical power and circumstance, and so he hit upon the radical idea of burning Rome down and building up a new Rome. We don't know what kind of magic has infested Rome, but it purified, and so he did that. He burnt Rome. And of course it didn't get rid of things, because it spurred the development of some very powerful written books called Gospels and other things, that all of a sudden the Christians come back stronger than ever. So they got Nero and 2 other emperors, and the 4th emperor in 1 year, 69 AD, because he had a radical new idea. Don't burn Rome, burn Jerusalem. Whoever they are, they will have their power from some power base, because Romans always think that way. Well, we burnt Rome and we didn't get their power. Their power base must be in a different city. Where's power base? It's in Jerusalem, in the temple. Well, all right, then burn it. And so the 4th emperor of that year, Vespasian, sent his oldest son, who was a very tough general, Titus. His younger son Domitian, been more vicious, but was still too young to let the viciousness come out. It came out 25 years later. Titus was given permission to capture Jerusalem and burn it and completely destroy the temple so that it would never again be able to be used. Take the base out of that power. And Vespasian got the vision in Alexandria. Because in Alexandria, when Vespasian was there, the people who were trying to make sure that he was Imperium. Nero was the last of the Caesars, but Vespasian was of the Flavian emperors, a different thing. And so they measured miracles for Vespasian. He moistened some Alexandrian dirt with his saliva and pasted it on blind eyes of a man who then regained his sight. There was a lame man brought to him, and Vespasian blessed him, and he walked. The blind can see, the lame can walk. These gospel miracles were reproduced in Alexandria with Vespasian. And so he figured he had the control of the initial gate, not the final gate of peace like Augustus, but the initial gate of a new power base. And so when he took over Rome and was rebuilding Rome to be rebuilt, he made a huge gate, an arch, a triumphal arch. It's called the Arch of Titus, because on the center of the arch is Titus coming back from Jerusalem, coming back from the temple, carrying the huge menorah that was the center of power. And it was put in frieze on the top of the Arch of Titus in the Foro Romano, and it's still there today. The Arc de Triomphe in Paris, all of these are triumphal arches that come from the Egyptian gateways that you must pass through, otherwise you can continue. So you will never come to world power again unless you pass through our gateway that we have established in the future. All of this came back to the head in the Renaissance when they discovered the ancient complications and reread the ancient books, and it came to a seething, searing head in the line of Elizabeth I and of James I. Because the British Empire realized we're going to control this and not Spain. They were going to Roman Empire. They had to have a way of curtailing magical power in the world, and so they used the King James Bible, because everyone will read the Word of God in the magician who challenged them effectively, William Shakespeare, so superbly that they never even knew it. Let's take a break. Let's come back to something that is contemporary for us. We live at a time where a new imperium is seeking to establish a permanent empire. One of the signs of the times is this edition of the Parables of Jesus, published in 1988 here in California. All of the red print is allowed sayings of Jesus. All the black print is what is not allowed. %, of the parables of Jesus are discredited by planetary scholarship, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, all together. Couldn't possibly have said these things. So we live in a time where the King James imperium and the Roman imperium is dwarfed. But the difficulty is there's always a real magician. There's always someone who knows how to not only speak it, but sing it. It's no small accident that church services not only have sermons to tell you what, but they have hymns to turn you loose. Shakespeare's church was the theater. His problem was that his family were Catholics in a Protestant country that persecuted Catholics, killed them. Just like the Catholics in certain countries persecuted Protestants and killed them. Or Jews were persecuted and killed. It's a round robin of a grasping for authority and trying to protect it. But no matter how difficult it is that there are people who do not believe in the right way or who do not obey in the right way, the kicker in the works are people who are magicians who could not be controlled even if you had power. It isn't a question of your having power over them, but they have the power to change your situation without you having anything to say about it. In the Roman Empire Imperium, it became increasingly clear by the end of the first century that there was some big magic going on here. And the last living person who knew Jesus was St. John. And he was commandeered out of his territory in Asia Minor in a big city called Ephesus. And he was taken to Rome like others had been taken to Rome and killed. This spot across the Tiber where Peter was crucified is where the Vatican is today, where St. Peter's Church is built on that site. The Roman emperor at the time was the last surviving son of Vespasian named Domitian, and his reign is called the Terror. Because it wasn't just crazy like Nero, but it was evil in the sense that it was methodically to get rid of anyone who had an access to visionary consciousness that could not be controlled, to seek them out especially, to kill the spiritual, essentially. And so when St. John, who at the time was near 75 years old, was brought before Domitian, the very presence of the man scared Domitian and all of his people. Because St. John at that time was energized to such an extent that it was palpable, not just charismatic, but to those who are trying to grab that, it's scary because every time you make a move to grab that, you get the sense that you're going to be electrocuted if you grab this. And so Domitian refused to have him killed and instead had him exiled to the perfect symbolic place, an island off the coast of what is today Turkey called Patmos. And Patmos is a rocky island without vegetation, and it's shaped like a ship. It's a rock ship that will never be able to go anywhere. So he exiled St. John to that island. And the torrential spiritual vision of St. John, wrote the book of Revelation on that island. That isn't that I'm not going anywhere. You are not going anywhere. Ever. In eternity. And within a year of that, Domitian was overthrown. An old man named Nerva was brought in just temporarily, and then a very consummate Roman gentleman general named Trajan took over the entire Roman Empire, and the reign of Trajan is the beginning of the golden age of Rome. But Trajan made a vow that he would never set foot in the city of Rome. He would rule the Roman Empire, but he would never enter the city of Rome himself. And when Trajan finished his rule after many, many successful years, Trajan expanded the Roman Empire to the largest extent it ever had. And his chosen successor was the Emperor Hadrian, who was a superb intellectual, gay, intellectual man, tremendously cultivated. And Trajan said, "You will have a successful reign, but remember, never go to Rome." And so Hadrian enjoyed the Trajan peace by traveling all over the Roman Empire all the time and never went to Rome. And the first emperor who was able to go to Rome in this new dispensation guarded himself so tightly and watched himself so completely every minute. His name was Marcus Aurelius. He's one of the classic writers of Stoic philosophy. Do not stray one iota from complete, perfect balance ever. I'm in Rome, but I'm not going to do anything to antagonize anything. And so when you see the statue of Marcus Aurelius on his horse, he has the blank, stony look of a man who has more power than anyone in the world and will not show anything more than just equanimity. And when you read the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, they've been classics all that time, for almost 2,000 years, of how to maintain in the midst of a storm an equanimity that it does not touch you. You are not touched. No matter what is going on, good or bad, you are not touched by it if you do not allow a connection. And so the meditations of Marcus Aurelius are a kind of a backdoor monasticism that's crept into the Roman emperor's house, into his person. He was a monk sitting on the throne without being religious about it. A very odd situation. By Elizabethan times, it was apparent that the Renaissance had raised all these issues again. And in the midst of the Renaissance came the Reformation, where people, certain brilliant, really smart people, said, we're in a position now because we can read the languages. We can read classical Greek again really well. Let's not just read Plato. Let's read the books of the New Testament that were written in classical Greek as well. I'm the first person to really read them with consummate intellectual mastery of the classical language was named Erasmus. He was Dutch. He was from Rotterdam. And his closest friend was John Colet, who was the dean of St. Paul's Church in London and was the master of St. Paul's School in London, which is the place in England where Ficino's Hermetic and Platonic Renaissance in Florence was introduced into England. by John Colet there. And another one of his close friends, along with Erasmus, was Sir Thomas More, who wrote Utopia. And so you had this little intellectual conclave in London at St. Paul's. And all of a sudden, Erasmus put out an edition of the New Testament, and he said all of the translations that they're using, both the Catholics and the Protestants, are complete corruptions. He went back and he retranslated from the original complex New Testament Greek. And one of the first persons, because he was a friend of Erasmus as well, to understand that this is like revolutionary was Martin Luther. And one of the watersheds is when Martin Luther was able, through Erasmus, to read the New Testament well enough to understand that there are certain books in the New Testament that are designated to the wrong authors. And the central book that's designated to the wrong author is the Epistle to the Hebrews. Everyone thought it was by St. Paul. Not in early classical antiquity, because they could read Greek well enough to understand, well, this is such a more superior style and the mastery of the form. The sermon in Greek is called hermeneia. It means capable of interpretation. It means it is an art form capable of a critique. And that it raises itself to a cosmic form which is capable of an analysis. Whereas St. Paul's letters, his epistles, have more of a traditional appeal, a mythic appeal, and they have a rhetorical structure. The Epistle to the Hebrews has a very sophisticated art structure. It's a lens that has not a pragmatic emphasis, but it has a prismatic resonance. And Erasmus and Luther were the first to see, well, the Epistle to the Hebrews could not possibly have been written by Paul. The only place that this kind of language was ever spoke and written in this way on this level was Alexandria. But that it wasn't written in Alexandria. It was written in some major place in Asia Minor, like Ephesus. Now, what is a sophisticated, super artistic, intellectual figure who obviously not only knows Christianity but Judaism inside out? Not only Judaism and Christianity, but knows not just the Platonic tradition inside out, but understands the Pythagorean structural tradition as well. Really sophisticated stuff. The only person in classical antiquity who had any kind of a base for that was Philo of Alexandria. So whoever wrote the Epistle to the Hebrews is obviously in the tradition of Philo of Alexandria. And Philo was the head of the Hellenistic Jewish community in Alexandria. There were more Jews in Alexandria than there were in Palestine. Alexandria is a huge city, almost 2 million people. Philo was the head of the Jewish community, so that whoever wrote the Epistle to the Hebrews obviously inherited the whole community. He was the head man, but it was a Jewish community that had already become Christian. But they weren't Christian in the Pauline way, and they weren't Christian in the Peter way. They were Christian in a Jewish way, a Hellenistic Jewish way that went back not to the Torah, but went back to the Davidic Solomonic line. It's not about following the law code. It's about opening up to the songs of life with the energy coursing through them. And that Torah had been replaced 600 BC already. Because in 600 BC, the Neo-Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar took over Palestine, took over Jerusalem, and hijacked all the talented men and women and took them back to run his Neo-Babylonian Empire. Not to imprison them, but to use them, because they were good at international trade even then. Good at finance, good. When that happened, two great prophets arose. One of them was in the Persian, Iranian, matriarchal matrix, and the other was in the Egyptian patriarchal matrix. The exile in Persia was one of enforcement to run the financial dealings of the enlarging Neo-Babylonian Empire, and the prophet there was Ezekiel. Whereas the other prophet was Jeremiah. But Jeremiah was in captivity too, but not by the Egyptians, not by the Neo-Babylonians, but by his own Jewish people. They kidnapped him against his will, and they took him to Egypt, just across the border. And he was held there as a prisoner. You are a prophet, you have to be here with us. Which left then Jerusalem and Palestine without any prophet at all, of false prophets. There are many at that time. Jeremiah says, this means that the old Mosaic Torah has come to a close, a failure, and there must be a new covenant. Not a covenant written on stone, but a covenant written in the hearts and minds of people that has a conscious syntax and not leaning on a ritual, symbolic base alone. And Ezekiel prophesied. He found that again and again he had these apocalyptic images that came to him. One of the first ones was the famous one that flying saucer people say was a visit by aliens, of seeing wheels within wheels way up in the air. Of Ezekiel is so powerful in his vision that he saw that the dry skeletons, the dry bones of people could be revivified back into life by a spiritual energy that was completely supernatural. These bones are going to dance again. Death is not final. And then he saw the most amazing thing. He saw a new radiant figure that was seated on a throne surrounded by 4 different symbolic animals. And later on, when they put the 4 Gospels together, each one of the Gospels was one of those animals: the eagle, the bull, the man, and in the center, you have the risen Messiah. So Ezekiel and Jeremiah both had this intense, split, forced vision. But when they were their descendants, they both died in exile. When the survivors were returned back to Palestine, they were returned from the Persian exile by Cyrus the Great. He said, you can go home again. And when they went home again, they ignored both Ezekiel and Jeremiah and went back to the old Torah, back to the old traditional ways. We're going to go back and we're going to just keep doing this. And we're going to build another temple. So that period is called the period of the Second Temple. Not Solomon's temple, but the Second Temple. It's that Second Temple that the Romans destroyed in 70 AD. Again, for the same reason, like a replay of history. But the prophet that was there was a very interesting prophet. Because the first prophet was a severe patriarchal type prophet, and his name was John the Baptist. And the other prophet was a loving prophet who loved the joy of the larger personal spiritual life that goes into the cosmos. His name was Jesus. So you have a replay 600 some years later of something which many people have observed. If you do not learn from history, you are condemned to repeat it over and over again until you do learn. Because if you go back to the same ambit, that same ambit is a circle. And you will follow that circle, and you will always come back exactly to where that circle goes. Because that circle has that kind of form built into it. It goes around, and whatever goes around comes around and goes around again. It's the wheel against which one is bound. In the Vajrayana, one of the ways to overcome that was a technique known as lam rim. It means having no bound. Yeah. The master of that was a very deep yogic master in India. His name was Tilopa. And the first Tibetan that he trained to do this was named Naropa. And Naropa trained a man named Marpa, who found a way to really transmit it in a high-powered way. And his transmission went to a man named Milarepa. And Milarepa secretly gave it to someone who didn't know he had it until years after Milarepa died. His name was Gampopa. And Gampopa found a way to transmit it to somebody who didn't expect, didn't want it, didn't know about it, a professional thief. He had a face that looked sort of like monkey, and he was a natural telepath, and he was the best thief you could imagine because he was telepathic. So when he came to rob Gampopa, Gampopa put the thought of enlightenment in his mind, and when that figure read his mind, he was enlightened. And he was the first Karmapa. Dusam Chimba. So high Dharma gets transmitted no matter what the authorities say. It doesn't make any difference. It doesn't matter how much power they have. It doesn't matter one bit, because one single spiritual being can walk through it as if it didn't even exist. They do not have a chance. And so compassion is not compassion for people who are suffering. You have to have compassion for those who are defeated permanently from before the get-go. They never had a chance. And so one has compassion for one's enemies because they're deeper than bound to lose. Their only way to be real is to lose and to recognize their failure. Here's a quotation from an Elizabethan writer named Reginald Scott, who wrote a special book on witchcraft and demons and demonology. Our mothers' maids have so terrified us with an ugly devil having horns on his head, fire in his mouth, and a tail in his breeches, eyes like a bison, fangs like a dog, claws like a bear, and a voice roaring like a lion, whereby we start and we're afraid by just a simple cry. And they have so frayed us with bull beggars, spirits, witches, urchins, elves, hags, fairies, centaurs, satyrs, pans, fauns, dwarfs, giants, imps, conjurers, changelings, incubus, Robin Goodfellow, hobgoblins, that even a right-hearty man scarce will pass through a churchyard at night without having his hair stand straight up. Why is it that is the churchyard cemeteries that have the biggest haunting in Elizabethan times? It is the church cemeteries where the demons collect. They live there. Shakespeare, in one of his plays, said, "Violent deaths leave ghosts." And the ghosts always collect to haunt around the place where they were killed. The demonic spirits were killed by the false authority, not by just whatever circumstance there was. And so they go exactly magnetically to that place. Shakespeare, all his life, honed himself to write one last great play, The Tempest, to show that there is a magician, a magical magician, who not only holds the key to the whole play, but after the play is over, like a reverberation, comes back and talks to the audience in magical ways, saying this: "Now my charms are all overthrown, and whatever strength I have is mine own, which is most faint now, 'tis true. I must be here confined by you, or sent to Naples. Let me not, since I have my dukedom got, and pardoned the deceiver, dwell in this bare island by your spell, but release me from my bands with the help of your good hands, gentle breath of yours, my sails must fill, or else my project fails, which was to please. Now I want spirits to enforce, air to enchant, and my ending is despair unless I be relieved by prayer, which pierces so that it assaults mercy itself and frees all faults. As you from crimes would pardon be, let your indulgence set me free." And he asked the audience to let him go. Faulkner said, at this moment, the great writer breaks his pen and lays it down, because he has accomplished something which is truly magical. He has found a spiritual form by which vision has been allowed to emerge into a person, into an artist. And that artist now is the grandfather phasing to the old ritual that imprisoned people originally. And so the spiritual person can reach grandfather phase back and touch the ritual and change it so it will not enslave any further, but will free. When one looks at the quick transform of a spiritual person, one is almost startled to find a very curious universal happening that occurs. One of the most graphic cases in planetary history is that of Abraham Lincoln. When Lincoln took office in 1860, he was a monumentally even-tempered frontiersman turned lawyer. And when he was assassinated just a little over 4 years later, Lincoln had become a spiritual master of the highest order. All during that time, there was the first great photographer in the United States, Matthew Brady, who tried over 100 times to take Lincoln's photograph, his portraiture. And he could never get it right. And he knew it wasn't because he didn't have the technique. Matthew Brady is one of the world's great photographers. And he finally said, towards the end, after Lincoln had been assassinated, he said, I have now understood why I couldn't take his photo. Because every single element in the facial feature of Lincoln was independent and only gestalted for a fraction of a second. And the camera was not fast enough to take a spiritual portrait because he was scintillating all the time. He was a little different all the time. And the camera picked that up. From moment to moment, he was a different facet of the spiritual person of Abraham Lincoln. When you go to see the Lincoln home in Springfield, Illinois, I remember being taken there at the age of 12 because my family were in Illinois before it was a state, 7th generation Illinois pioneer. And I remember my old great aunt, Meta Weir, she lived to be 104. She said, you pay attention here because we are still Lincoln people. He's still here. His spirit is still here. Occasionally you'll find it in Chicago, but you will always find it down here in southern Illinois, where the people live in the spirit of that kind of prism. We are still Lincoln people. She had seen him personally as a young girl, so I talked to someone who had seen Lincoln. It's this quality that Shakespeare has to the nth degree, and that the Tempest, written right at the time where the King James Bible was authorizing the right way to read religion for the new nascent British Empire. The Tempest is the magic of the new world that is going to be brought into being, not by the magician so much, but by the magician passing on his powers to the audience, to the people. It is the people who will have the power to set someone free. And so one has a distribution of the power in the people and not the pyramid pecking order of power in the thrones headed by the king or the emperor or the pharaoh. And so Shakespeare's Tempest is the first movement of the vision of a new world, of a new kind of humanity. It's the beginnings of it. That's where it begins, right there. Shelley's Prometheus Unbound, which we'll get into next week deeper and more, comes at a time where the Shakespeare Renaissance ethos had gone through a deep christening where the art of Shakespeare was expanded almost too much into science, so that the scientific power of Shelley's time was beginning to be apparent. And by the time he wrote Prometheus Unbound, 1820, it was apparent that man was going to have supernatural scientific powers that he had never had before. And so there had to be some new way to do this. But you cannot just have a vision, you have to be able to deliver it, which means, like any visionary, you have to have a new poetic. And just as Shakespeare made a new poetic for English, Shelley tried to make a new poetic for English in his time as well. There's not much you can do if you only live to be 30. It's just not enough time. It takes a while. Not just to have the visions, but because a new poetic takes a long while. It took me 40 years to be able to speak this way, extempore. And I cut it down because it's in a graduated education. I can talk that talk if I have to. Big time. But we're here in a graduated way so that we get acquainted, so that it isn't my dazzle, but is your sparks that count. It's the distribution of the learning in the population of the people, and it's not for the aggrandizement of the teacher. Krishnamurti once said he was disappointed in all the gurus that came over to commandeer people. He said the word guru means one who points the way and then gets out of your way so you can go. That's what a guru is. It's over there, and if you'll go in this way, you'll find something worthwhile. Those who lead, who do not step out of the way, they are the false prophets. It's as if they cooked a beautiful meal, but you were not allowed to eat it. They ate it. Or they gave you photographs and cookbooks and said, well, this is how we did it. Watch me eat. The planet is seething like a churchyard graveyard at night. I suppose they thought that no one would come and pull the plug. But they always do. More next week.